This is a Global News special presentation.
On July the 1st, on Canada Day, Alberta's public health measures will be lifted and our lives will get back to normal. We had all hoped this summer that we could put COVID behind us once and for all. That was certainly my hope, and I said so very clearly.
2021 was another year dominated by COVID-19 in Alberta, with a roller coaster of restrictions around attempts to fully reopen the economy. Over the past 12 months, the disease killed more than 2,100 Albertans, and we enter the new year still unclear on when the pandemic will end. On December 7th, Premier Kenney sat down with Global News for a look back at 2021 and to discuss his plans for 2022 and beyond. This is our conversation with the Premier. January 1st of last year, obviously not the way you wanted to start there. You had to come out, you had staff members and caucus members travel.
That's brutal.
What lessons did you learn from that?
Well, we learned that for a couple of things. First of all, people shouldn't have traveled, and I should have made it more clear to them back then at the time. I think that Albertans are making great sacrifices. Last Christmas, there were much more rigorous COVID rules than there are now, and it was just set absolutely the wrong tone. So that's why action was taken on that, and the lesson was learned.
A few months later, there was the Sky Palace dinner. What happened there? I mean, obviously Albertans were following restrictions again, and you had to come out and apologize again.
Well, we had just opened up outdoor socializing for up to, I think, 10 people. 6 folks got together for an outdoor business dinner. We were slightly less than the required 2 meters apart in a couple of points. I think it was a little bit blown out of proportion. People I heard from in the public said, look, you're allowed to get outside and socialize. It's a lot safer than doing it inside, and it was a working dinner. So I think that was much ado about very little.
You think that was more politics than actual public?
Yeah, absolutely.
You opened the economy right ahead of Stampede. Obviously, you made your decision clear at that point why we had to get going. The vaccinations were going up. We saw the 4th wave come after that. Do you have any regrets about how fast we opened up, considering what happened in the months after that?
Not about opening up, because in June and July, first of all, we had expert advice from our officials that it was right to open up, that we were moving from pandemic to endemic stage, and looked at the international data on the efficacy of vaccines in countries that had similar levels of vaccine coverage as Alberta at the time. And cases were extremely low, hospitalizations were very low. And Tom, I've always thought you can't maintain public compliance with lockdown style policies forever. Like, people just won't comply. And it doesn't matter, you can have the most rigorous COVID policies on paper, but if the vast majority of the population is not observing them, you're just undermining really the buy-in that you require for those policies to be effective. So I think it was right to relax the measures in this summer. But clearly we misread the impact of Delta on the unvaccinated population. And that's what hit us hard in September. We course corrected when we saw that coming and impacting the healthcare system. We brought in the restriction exemption program and a number of other measures, mandatory indoor masking. And I just want to say thank you to Albertans for rising to the challenge, for being diligent, for really crushing the 4th wave. We have to continue to be cautious, but at the end of the day, we also have to get on with life. And that's the balance we've got to figure out.
You course corrected in September. There were a lot of medical experts, physicians out there saying in August, this is coming, we need to act now. Why didn't we act in August?
Well, Tom, when we received advice to bring in additional measures, we did. And we did take measures actually in August. We, for example, started to expand booster shots to seniors living in congregate care. We did not move forward with some of the planned relaxations that had been announced by Dr. Hinshaw. So we did begin a course correction in August, but when we saw the numbers really starting to mount at the beginning of September, we took more rigorous action. I just want to say to Albertans, we're now 21 months into this, and I know people are so sick and tired of it and so frustrated with this having disrupted our lives for so long. But I really believe now that we're at 90% first dose coverage of the adult population, we've got booster shots rolling out, the pediatric vaccines, new therapeutic medications are being approved and coming on stream. We are much better equipped. And I just want to say thank you to people for their diligence, and we've got to figure out a way to move forward. We can't stay pinning down society for years to come. We have to begin to move forward with careful, measured confidence in getting lives somewhat back to normal here.
I'll get back to that point in a second. I hate to belabor the point, but looking back now, obviously the healthcare system was on the brink of collapse. You said at the start of September we're 10 or 14 days away from serious issues here. Thousands and thousands of surgeries canceled. Would you have done it any differently?
Well, perhaps we should have brought in some of these measures earlier, but the government, we act on the advice that we receive. This was based on an analysis of how other jurisdictions have performed. We got hit harder in Alberta because we had lower levels of vaccination than other Canadian provinces. Apart from Saskatchewan, they were pretty much tied with us in the fourth wave in terms of its impact. Obviously in retrospect, it would have been preferable to have higher vaccination rates. But when we made these decisions in June, other countries like the United Kingdom and Israel had performed very well, opening up completely at lower levels of vaccination. So I think it was a good faith decision based on data, not a random one based on politics. There's going to be a lot of lessons to learn from this, and that clearly will be one of them.
I want to go back to what you're saying now, trying to get back to some semblance of normal. We're seeing Omicron here now. What do you need to see before you move on from the restrictions exemption program?
We're still learning about Omicron and what kind of a threat it might represent. I mean, so far, the early data suggests that it's not increasing severe outcomes and lethality of the disease, but it's clearly very contagious. So, at some point, this disease is going to probably follow the same path as the Spanish flu between 1918 and 1920, when more and more contagious variants spread around the world, but with less lethality and less severe outcomes. Let's hope that's what Omicron is, but we have to be careful and prudent as the data comes in, and we can make decisions about that.
Still to come in our conversation with Premier Jason Kenney, surging oil prices and billions of dollars in petrochemical announcements have injected some optimism into Alberta's economy. From balancing the budget to reviewing the revenue structure, we hear what the Premier has planned for the provincial economy.
With the increase in revenues, with economic growth, I think we have a good shot at getting to a balanced budget and beginning to pay down our debt within the next couple of years.
What does the economy look like in Alberta 10 years from now?
Well, I think it's going to be an incredibly strong economy for the next several years as we put the pedal to the metal on diversification while leveraging our great natural resources. The petrochemical investments happening in the Edmonton area, the hydrogen investments, all of the carbon capture, utilization, storage investments, we're talking collectively tens of billions of dollars of investment that have either been announced or are forthcoming, thousands and thousands of good high-paying jobs, while greening the Alberta economy, reducing our emissions, bringing on stream new cutting-edge technology, which means diversification. But also, these industries require feedstock. They require, for example, natural gas, which means upstream exploration and production. So I've always believed that diversification and the energy sector are not opposed to one another, that the two are linked together. And there's diversification happening, of course, in totally different areas here. Tech is taking off, venture capital investments, startups, big new global tech companies moving to Alberta, film and television, and forestry, so many other industries. I think it's going to be an exciting period. I predict that the biggest challenge over the next 10 years will be a people challenge. Will we have enough workers with the right skills for the jobs that will become available?
So on that front, you've been heavily criticized by many for the cuts to the post-secondary education budget here. Tuitions have gone up for students here. How do we keep a highly skilled, highly educated workforce while we are seeing these types of barriers put in place in front of students?
So, first of all, why have we had to find some savings? Because this government inherited a $9 billion structural deficit that was unsustainable. You just can't continue to run massive deficits forever, because ultimately that just crushes your taxpayers. You have to raise taxes, that drives people out, it kills investment in jobs as well. And you don't want to get stuck in a debt trap where you're spending billions on interest payments to the banks. So we went, for outside advice for the McKinnon panel, for example. How do we gradually control Alberta government spending. And one area that they identified as an outlier in Alberta was the cost of our post-secondary institutions, which were substantially above the Canadian average. Do you know the University of Alberta, which is a great institution, love it, fantastic programs, but it was spending as much as the University of Toronto. U of T has twice as many students. So our universities have been at the top of the cost curve amongst Canadian universities, and our tuition has been below. So we're trying to encourage the universities to operate a bit more efficiently. I think these are responsible changes. We'll continue to have world-class universities, and we'll continue to have the advantage of the highest incidence of post-secondary education, with particularly in STEM disciplines, and I believe we'll continue to have the youngest population in Canada.
For students facing higher costs, can they expect more supports, particularly on the lower end of the income file?
Well, yeah, there is support there for them, but at the end of the day, the most important support for a student is a good job when they get out of university. And that's what the Alberta Advantage has always been about. That's why we've been a magnet for young people from across the country who want to work hard and get ahead. Our per capita incomes are substantially higher than the rest of the country. Our cost of living is substantially lower. So there are other advantages, long-term, lifetime financial and economic advantages for students graduating from Alberta post-secondary institutions.
As we see all these new investments, new technologies, lithium is a possibility here in Alberta. How do we get the regulatory system in place for that? Do we have that, or is that still work to be done?
Oh, well, we have this thing called the Alberta Recovery Plan, which is our overarching strategy to recover from the COVID economic disaster. And part of that is getting the regulatory framework for these new industries. Like, for example, mineral mining, rare earth minerals, lithium is very present in Alberta. You need that for batteries. And obviously in green tech, lithium is in huge demand. But there's been such a focus on oil and gas that it kind of took up all the oxygen in the room when it came to mining exploration. So we didn't really have a robust regulatory framework. So we're doing all of the geological mapping that we have in the government, making that available, providing regulations. We're doing that on things like helium. We're doing it on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is going to be key to reduce our emissions and ensure a future for oil and gas. So there's a whole bunch of these future industries where we actually are creating the optimal regulatory environment, while at the same time we're cutting job-killing regs. We've eliminated 120,000 regs in 2.5 years, which is about 20% of the red tape burden on Alberta's economy. We've gone from an F to an A in the CFIB's red tape report card. That is once again becoming a big part of the Alberta Advantage.
Finance Minister Travis Taves came out and spoke about the Q2 numbers, and they were looking a lot better, obviously oil a bunch higher. He says, you're getting close on the driving down the cost curve. We're getting close to that, getting to the average marker. What is next? Once you get to that, what's next?
Yeah, we never intended or came to office with the intention of deep cuts like in the early 90s. The Klein government cut spending by nearly 20%. When this is all said and done, we probably will have reduced overall program spending by about 2% for what was the biggest spending and least efficient provincial government in Canada. Every household, every business, every nonprofit knows that they could find 2% of their budget if they needed to. So this is getting us down over time, but by through attrition in some public service positions, responsible management in collective bargaining, and some targeted savings. We are going from about 20% above the Canadian average for provincial governments in cost to the Canadian average. That we think is a sustainable track. And with the increase in revenues, with economic growth, I think we have a good shot at getting to a balanced budget and beginning to pay down our debt within the next couple of years.
He also spoke about the revenue panel. It's going to take a look. Is there anything that is off the table for this revenue panel? I know it hasn't been formed yet, but is there anything that you don't look at that?
Ultimately, I'm against a sales tax, and Albertans have to decide if they want a sales tax because there's a law required that they would vote on it in a referendum. So I don't think there's much of a point in proposing something that the vast majority of Albertans are opposed to. I think most Albertans see that as part of the Alberta Advantage. But the revenue panel was designed to say, how can we come up with a more pro-growth competitive tax system that helps us to create jobs? And that's what they'll be looking at.
Coming up next in our conversation with Premier Jason Kenney, with the election now just over a year and a half away, Premier Kenney is still attempting to push forward on some unpopular policies. including a push to develop coal mines on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains.
If they can do this responsibly under an NDP government in British Columbia, I believe in principle we can do it responsibly on a limited basis here in Alberta.
We're a year and a half away from the next election. We're obviously hearing NDP policy platform planks. When are we going to start hearing UCP policy?
Well, we're still focused on implementing our platform from 2019. Tom, let me be blunt. In the last election, we had a pretty strong lead in the year or two in advance of the election. We didn't need to have a detailed to take the risk of a detailed platform, but we did. We put 372 specific commitments out there, by far the most detailed platform in Alberta electoral history. And because we knew the province needed deep change to get our economy back on track. And so our focus right now is continuing implementation of the last campaign commitments. We're at about 85% now. We have a bit more to go. And then we'll start platform development for the next election, which will continue, we hope, the economic momentum. That will be the focus. How do we keep building on the growth and the diversification that we're seeing?
A couple of those policy platforms that you're still working on have proven to be unpopular and have seen quite a bit of pushback. Coal policy on the eastern slopes. Is your government still looking for a way to find coal development on that while still managing concerns with the environment from area landowners?
Our general approach is to support responsible resource development, as we've always done in Alberta. And we have a consultation, a panel, talking to Albertans about how do we get that right balance when it comes to coal. There have been coal mines up and down the eastern slopes in Alberta since European people arrived here in the 1870s. And so this has been a constant part of our economic history. And there are entire communities, like Grand Cache, for example, that depend on it. I'm not one of those cold-hearted people who just says, we're going to turn those into ghost towns. In British Columbia, under an NDP government, they have over 10 coal mines operating to support global demand for steel making, for example, and thermal coal for Asian power plants. So I think if they can do this responsibly under an NDP government in British Columbia, I believe in principle we can do it responsibly on a limited basis here in Alberta to find that right balance between environmental preservation and job creation.
You pressed pause on some areas of the curriculum. Obviously, there have been a number of concerns from parents, teachers, Indigenous leaders. Why the decision to press pause, and how are you going to move forward on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, COVID kind of has disrupted everything, including the school system. We've seen a lot of learning loss, a lot of disruption in the schools. And we just heard from parents, teachers, school boards, and others that given that, we should go a little bit slower on rolling out the improved curriculum. So we'll be proceeding next year with the really good improvements on math and reading and wellness, physical education and wellness, taking more time to consult with Albertans on things like the social studies curriculum, to have an extra year. That means teachers can focus, instead of having to change their lessons for every subject all at once, after the challenge of COVID, give them a bit of a breather to focus on, I think, the most important subjects for student outcomes, reading and writing, and then we can pilot and have more time to make changes to the social curriculum, an extra year for that to come out. So it's a more measured pace. I think that's good for teachers, kids, parents, and the whole system.
On social, is it going to be a complete rewrite, or is it based on what it is now, just try to tweak it a little bit?
There'll definitely be changes, but probably not a complete rewrite. We want a content-rich curriculum. And there is a philosophical difference here. There are other people who just want to basically teach abstract concept to kids rather than content. We actually think that children should know what our history is as Canadians, good, bad, and indifferent. How our institutions, our parliamentary democracy developed. Obviously, the history of our Indigenous people on these lands and their ongoing contribution. The things like the rule of law, how did that develop in our system? So our military history. We think kids should know about 120,000 Canadians who made the ultimate sacrifice in the defense of our freedoms. This requires teaching actual content, and that's really what we're trying to get at through the Reformed Social Studies curriculum.
Alberta Provincial Police Service, RMA, rural leaders say, that's focusing in the wrong area, we want to focus on prevention areas. Even in the Fair Deal panel, it didn't prove to be a very popular idea in its polling. Why push forward with this?
I really believe that there may be great merit to having a stronger community policing model. And I just encourage folks, municipalities and others, to read the report that we've come out with, which recommends, I think, a really interesting model. Look, Edmonton and the major cities in this province, they have the benefit of a local community police force. That means a Edmontonian can grow up, go to the academy, and serve in the Edmonton Police Force in their neighborhood, in their community, that they know well for the rest of their lives. That means better policing, more rooted in the community. But while we respect the RCMP, the challenge in rural Alberta is a constant rotation of people from across the country in and out of those communities, often creating service gaps. That's been part of the problem with the rural crime wave. A provincial police force, like they have in Quebec and Ontario, like we had in Alberta before the Depression, can fill that gap. A kid in Wetaskiwin should be able to grow up and serve as a cop in Wetaskiwin for the rest of their lives, knowing the community. I think there's great strength in that. We're talking about a new governance model, a police commission that would have permanent representation from Indigenous communities for the first time in Canadian history. We're also talking in this model about very progressive integration of social services, psychologists, children's service workers, and alternative drug courts into the policing system. So I think this can help us to address questions about racism, frankly, that we have seen coming from Indigenous communities being victimized. It can help us to address the rural crime issues. And we haven't made a final decision, but I certainly think it's worth looking at.
I ask this every year. What do you hope 12 months from now we're talking about? We'll be 6 months from an election. So what do you hope we're talking about?
I hope we're talking about incredible economic growth and diversification. I hope a year from now, we will look back and see that the damage in the Alberta economy incurred since 2015 is completely in the rearview mirror. And I hope a year from now, the number one problem that we're talking about is not enough people for the jobs that are available. So, and by the way, I actually think that's what we'll be talking about on New Year's Day in 2023. We led Canada economic growth in 2021. We are projected to lead again in 2022. We're second fastest growing in terms of jobs. There is record years in a whole bunch of industries. So I think this is going to be an exciting time, please God, as we get past COVID, into a place where the sky is the limit.
2022 promises to be another busy year. The provincial budget will be tabled in February. Negotiations with nurses are still ongoing. And Premier Kenney will go through a leadership review. Thank you for joining us for our conversation with the Premier. Have a happy New Year. For news at any time, visit our website, globalnews.ca.